Hello and welcome to this webinar from Gluware on the Gluware 4.2 release, which is expanding our security, audit, and more. I am Michael Howe, VP of Product Marketing, and today I'm inviting along with me for the ride is Tim Silverline, our new VP of Security, joining us on the product team to lead our security efforts. So Tim, great to have you with me today. Thank you for joining.
Yep, thanks, Mike.
And here it's the end of January. How are you doing on your New Year's resolutions? Falling off the wagon yet, or how we...
I'm actually just starting to get back in shape from a cycling perspective. So
that's awesome. I am not eating clean and not working out yet, but I'm about to get started here in February. Okay, start on the shortest month of the year. All right. So jumping into the webinar here, what we're going to talk about is just a quick, brief overview of Gluware for those who are not as familiar with the platform and how we perform automation orchestration. The key capability here is around what's new in 4.2. Then we have a little special announcement, kind of a preview we're going to talk to, and a little bit of a teaser, and then jump in through some live demos to let you see the new features in action and a call to action, how you can engage and work with Gluware. So let's jump into the content. First, we want to share some news with you if you hadn't seen it or heard it on social or on our webpage. GigaOM produced a radar report for Net DevOps, the very end of the year. Net DevOps is a very cutting edge area of automation orchestration that's encompassing or beginning to include DevOps oriented approaches, which can help to improve the reliability and the agility when you think about DevOps uses CI/CD pipelines. And so a very exciting report from GigaOM, who looked at a bunch of vendors in this space. Gluware came out really on top, being named the only leader and outperformer. So you can go to gluware.com/GigaOM and download this report, check it out for yourself. We also want to share that on February 23rd at 9 a.m. Pacific, we are doing a webinar with the Register, a great news source, and GigaOM and ourselves. So please hit our webinars page and register for that. So I'm excited to share that content with you and talk to you about how Gluware was excited to be named a leader in this space. So moving on. 2 slides to introduce Gluware to you. One is when you think about Gluware, we are a pure software solution. Our goal in life from a product standpoint is to bring organization and automation to that kind of inherently chaotic network and the underlying infrastructure. When you think about multi-domain, multi-vendor, and now moving towards multi-cloud, Gluware can offer automation across all those spectrums: multi-vendor, multi-domain, multi-cloud, your LAN, WAN, data center, and now with our Terraform integration introduced the end of last year. Well, the end of 2020, with the Terraform integration, we are now automating cloud architectures as well. What you're going to hear from us, and although the marketing has maybe made it a little washed, is that we use an intent-based approach. Our intelligent orchestration engine processes information, enabling you to provide the intended state and allow Gluware to just do the hard work of automating it for you across the infrastructure in a declarative manner. And it's not about being one particular thing, like just automating configurations. It's about lifecycle management. So this is the rolling out of new sites, the moves, the adds, changes, the ongoing drift monitoring and auditing, which we're going to be talking about in this webinar, and being able to remediate problems in the network. So it's really taking the approach of lifecycle management and automating as many network operations tasks as we can. And we'll talk a little bit more about how, in addition to the products we deliver, the platform is highly extensible with the Gluware Lab IDE. So next slide of my 2-slide intro. And I will annotate on this one a little bit just for clarity to show you where I'm talking about. I will use my pen. The heart and soul, or the key to the Gluware solution, is the intelligent orchestration engine. This is a data model driven platform and capability where we are processing data models. So when we ingest information about the network, we're wrapping that information in data models. When we are defining configurations and looking at even CLI, we're wrapping that in data models and defining it in the system. Therefore, when we perform any automated action, Gluware is reading the current state, comparing it to the desired state, and then rendering the commands necessary to put it into that desired state and then validating. So it's a full closed loop effort, read write to CLI or API. And that intelligent orchestration engine can do things, as simple as, banner and NTP and DNS and things like that, or as complicated as EVPN, VXLAN in the data center. So we're talking about, moving and transforming your config into policy from a feature standpoint, even from a network-wide standpoint. What users really love about the platform is that we deliver a suite of applications that enable you to hit the ground running. So with Device Manager, you can inventory and discover your network and really get a sense of what's going on. You're going to hear about upcoming or what we're just recently introducing with NIST integration. We're going to expand on that. In the next phase, you're executing config drift and audit, where you're monitoring your configurations for change. And through Syslog integration, you can know exactly who and when changed the configuration, and then you can remediate. With audit, you can perform ongoing auditing or monitoring of the config to see if you are conforming to your policy or third-party policies. OS Manager lets you fully automate the upgrade, downgrade cycle. Unfortunately, having to do this more often now as vendor vulnerabilities come out and have to execute operating system upgrades to move away from those vulnerabilities. Config modeling is where we are really wrapping configurations into data models and allow intelligent policy management of any network-wide or domain-wide configuration change. So again, this is around those daily moves, adds, changes that you're doing on the network. You define it in Gluware config modeling as a policy. We use the intelligent engine to push that down to the network, and you get very highly reliable changes at scale. And then workflows are around process automation. And this is a key area we're going to talk to and we're expanding on as well. So you have the suite of applications, you have the intelligent orchestration engine, and then from a standpoint of what we're automating, it's the multi-vendor, physical or virtual, multi-domain network. So it's routers, switches, load balancers, firewalls, WAN optimizers, wireless LAN controllers, and we're going to talk more and more about API endpoints. So customers also love that Gluware is not predetermining exactly how what features you're supposed to automate. You have the ability to bring your own config, bring your own design, bring your own policy. So whatever the vendor supports in an underlying operating system, Gluware enables the automation of any of those configurations, those features, or architectures. And then we have third-party integration that we're going to talk about as well through API. So Gluware being this intelligent orchestration engine, we're available as a SaaS, or with Gluware Enterprise, we can be deployed on-prem, highly distributed and scalable architecture with our zone engine architecture. We scale to tens of thousands of devices. We have some very large global enterprise customers running today. And then I touched on it a little bit before, but we've also launched into the marketplace our IDE. Gluware Lab is the way in which features are customized, built, API integrations are performed, fully available to the customer to enable you to do that yourself. So hopefully within these two slides here, you have a basic understanding about what Gluware is and what we offer with automation orchestration. So moving on, to get to the heart of this presentation is what's new in 4.2. And I'll just start by saying that Gluware our engineering works in an agile manner. And oftentimes we're able to release things to our customers, faster by making it more modular and releasing in an agile manner. This release was broken up into 3 parts that have been made available. The first part released end of November, which was our enhanced API package. So I'm going to speak in more detail around this, but GluAPI is our RESTful API and added numerous things, including integration with our Data Explorer app and enhancing our config drift and audit. In the December release, we provided a full next-gen version of our config audit capability. So our customers were very excited to get their hands on this. Supports very powerful operators and more complex rules. and more integration with role-based access control, much more granular control of who can do what. So we're going to show you that. We also, here in the end of January here, the build is going through final QA and regression testing, and we'll be releasing this week, is the integration with NIST. So NIST provides multi-vendor vulnerability notification and the NIST vulnerability database. So now we can take your inventory, send it to the NIST API, and pull all of the related vulnerabilities related to the infrastructure and the equipment in your inventory. So we're going to highlight that feature. And the final one here is around notification. We had already integrated Syslog as being a Syslog listener to capture when users were accessing systems in a config. We could trigger a drifter audit. This next phase of Syslog integration integrates Gluware as a Syslog sender. So we can send Syslog messages across various things to your monitoring systems. So let's jump into the content. First, GluAPI. I wanted to provide a little more context around what GluAPI is, and that, Gluware is an automation orchestration platform. Most users are logging into our web-based UI and then navigating into one of the applications and implementing automation. But you don't necessarily want your automation to exist on an island. Sometimes you have other systems you want to integrate via API. You may have another orchestrator. And so having a published RESTful API helps you plug into the ecosystem of network management. So when you enable that, an API endpoint is turned on and that service is enabled. It has built-in documentation. It is fully REST-based or compliant as a typical REST interface, leveraging HTTP URLs with the common, get and post type actions. We have common authorization, and that is hooked into our RBAC. So whatever user or username password combination you're authenticating with, those same role-based access features carry on. It is fully JSON data model compliant as well, meaning all the return structures are wrapped in JSON data modeling. We support Swagger or Open API specification for rapid onboarding. And in fact, in this release, we've updated that to Open API 2.0. So with this, the introduction to this, I do want to bring in Tim into the conversation. Tim, when users start to open up APIs or turn on APIs in software platforms in their enterprise, and these platforms may have access to your network or network management or information, what do they need to be thinking about from a security perspective?
Right. Well, obviously, the most important thing is you want to make sure that you're authenticating all of your API requests and doing so in a secure manner, just to make sure that only the authorized users are able to get in and make these changes. The second piece is making sure that what you're exposing via API, as far as the commands and the controls they're able to do inside of the system, that's being restricted in a way that makes sense to the administrators, and you're limiting those users to only being able to do what they're supposed to be able to do.
Excellent. And what you're going to see when we jump into the live demo is how with the APIs that we're executing with Gluware, we're passing the credentials for authentication. So we're authenticating that user, and that how the role-based access control is applied as well. So I think you'll see that from Gluware and shouldn't have any security concerns if you're implementing properly when turning this on with Gluware. So use cases our customers are doing is sometimes they have external inventory management systems. So Gluware is pulling the network and discover the network live. We can pull that inventory from an external system. They can make an API to call to Gluware, pulling in that inventory, that live inventory, and then synchronizing it with their something that cannot talk to the network. So when you think of an external source of truth, you can pull data which from the live network, and then essentially synchronize and ensure you're still on track. I mentioned this before, but this is an area we've been enhancing around is external systems making API calls to trigger monitoring a drift or running an audit on your network. We're going to talk a bit about that going forward as well. Change management approvals. You may want API integration to come from something like a ServiceNow or a Remedy. So when a change is approved, you can trigger the provisioning of that change through an API call. And this ties into deploying config changes. Again, you may have a customer request ticketing system or even a homegrown platform. And then once you have approval for that change, you can execute the change through Gluware through an API call. So just a few of the basics on how customers are leveraging and using the GluAPI support and capabilities. So with the new API package, let me run over a couple of the highlights. And again, when we run to the demo, I'll show you how you can pull up the API documentation and you can see all the calls and parameters that are available. But in Device Manager, there's a new time zone parameter. This is super helpful when you're working in multiple time zones and you want to understand the time stamps and when things occurred, especially like an audit. In config modeling, you're able to execute the preview and provisioning commands and they have an optional description. Descriptions, again, are super handy when you are wanting to add a label that is then searchable so you can understand when or why something was executed. The Data Explorer is our newest application in the application suite. Data Explorer allows you to create any report that you would like to from the underlying database. Now through the API, you can pull your templates, you can run your report, and you can retrieve those results in JSON format. Moving on, the big bulk of the work around the API package enhancements is around the config, drift, and audit application. So you can pull your list of devices with various query parameters, like when they were last updated or when they were last audited. You can search your devices by an audit status or audited on or certain fields. So again, this is like kind of just making that API more interactive like you would like to do on a user. In the UI, you can search and sort and do things. Now some of these same things are kind of being exposed at a programmatic level. You can search snapshot endpoints and return latest config snapshots for a device. So when you turn on a drift or an audit, you can trigger to actually capture a new snapshot of the configuration. So the term snapshot just replies to the latest copy of a config that was pulled. Again, additional description parameters also added on with search capabilities with drift and audit. You can take a look at your results and show execution failures per device and list out the specific rules that cause the audit to fail. So again, we always hope these things run, without failure or without, flagging errors and issues. But the key thing is like when you run an audit and you have a list of devices that fail, you now have to run a subsequent command to then pull that list that did fail, right? And you want that. The final bullet there is around the ability to name audit executions and make them searchable. So really just making the API control much more usable. And we have a number of organizations using this that most of these requests are derived out of. So moving on, the next big rock of this release is around our config audit capability. This is one of our most popular applications. When you start using Gluware, oftentimes you use Device Manager, you're doing a discovery, discovering your network devices, you're getting an accurate inventory. Then the next point is you want to know, where am I at with my configurations? How consistent are my configs? Am I compliant to any third-party specifications? And so they begin to run the audit app. And so, Tim, if I could bring you into this topic, what's important, or what should users be thinking about with auditing configurations? And I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the third-party specifications that are out there, like CIS and NIST and the DoD STIG and some of these other security-related config audits I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. So just auditing configs in general on a global network scale is really important just as a whole. One of the things to think about is, attackers that are trying to get into networks often only have to find one hole, right? And so as your network continues to grow and you have, hundreds or thousands of different devices, how do you ensure that you maintain that security and the compliance standards that you set across all of them to not leave them that one hole? And that's really where automation comes in to make sure that they're all consistent. Regarding the different various standards out there, I think CIS probably has the most comprehensive as far as the largest coverage of devices. And they have a pretty good baseline standard to try to make sure that you're setting up things at least to a good baseline and have some of the security controls in place. Definitely like CIS, and I think it's really helpful to have that standard out there so that companies have common frameworks to start with. But reality is a lot of those standards don't take into some of the more advanced features that some of the security type devices might have. And really, those tend to be more OEM specific. So certain vendors also have their own standards that they'll publish and guidelines that they promote. And I always recommend taking a look at those to see what sort of advanced security features you might be able to implement that might not be included in the CIS standard, either because they might be complicated or potentially they're just too new and the standard has not been updated yet to take advantage or take into account those new features.
That's great feedback. And I hear that a lot where, that kind of the CIS spec is like a great kind of first step or baseline. It's nice starting from a point where you're not starting from scratch. And so you get like a deep set of rules, and then you can go and see how they apply to your network. I think kind of where the decision factor really comes in is, do those rules apply to what I have? And then you as an implementer may have other configuration parameters and other things that are not covered by that specification. And so there's always a layer of customization, and you need to know that. I think the beauty of Gluware's config audit capabilities, it is a no-code interface. You don't have to go and write logic in Python or some other programming language. It's not a UI on top of a script. What you're going to see in this latest release, especially the big significant difference, is around the support for conditional language, the whole if then or if then else type of capabilities. And I really think this is a pretty dramatic change and improvement, because there are so many conditions like, well, if it's a North America, I want to check for this, or if it's a BGP route reflector, right? There's all these kind of conditional things of depending on what role the device is playing or where the device is located that can come into it. So I think it's a little difficult if you were to say, required or forbidden. And the old Gluware implementation, it was more hard and fast. This is required and this is forbidden. And there was kind of limited filtering. You'd essentially filter on your operating system. Now with this really robust capability, you can add logic and dig into it deeper. So just a few more highlight of some features here. You have the severity level you can control. You have policy level, meaning I can tie RBAC to who can have access to the policy. There is a device policy view, so you can look at it on a per device basis. A feature I really like is the ability to test or validate a rule. So if I'm building a rule and I want to see how it would fare with a given configuration, I can go into my rule validator, paste in a config, test the rule, and see what's going to happen. So I think this is really going to help you speed up cycles and developing your rule sets and making sure they're going to be applicable to your configurations. That one, I think, for me, is maybe the second biggest feature after the conditional language. And then just since the format is changing, when you first upgrade to 4.2, Gluware will convert all your existing policies into the new format. So what you're seeing in this snapshot is a more advanced type of rule with conditional logic. We also have the same or kind of legacy support for basic rules, which are required and forbidden. So all of your existing policies will be converted into this new format. And we still have the ability to import and export policies in a JSON-based format. So that's there as well. But what I would say is, what you might want to do is before you upgrade, you could back up all your policies in JSON. You could save them out if you haven't already, and just make sure you have a backup just in case. It's just for good practice. So something to mention there. But very excited for a lot of our users have begun to use the new audit capability that was introduced in the December release. So very excited to get this out there more broadly used. Moving on is the next big rock of this release is around the NIST integration. So those of you who have been using Gluware or following Gluware, you may know we already had third-party integration with Cisco and the support APIs that pulled information like end of life, end of sale, your SmartNet contract, and PCerts. Cisco vulnerabilities are called PCerts. We've now added API integration with NIST, And the big benefit of NIST is that it's a multi-vendor database. And so the majority of the vendors out there, and again, we're at 30 plus operating systems, but vendors like HP Aruba and Fortinet and Juniper and Arista and Palo Alto are all populating into the NIST vulnerability database. And now Gluware has the ability to take your inventory, cross-check it with the NIST database, and determine what CVEs exist. So, Tim, back tying this in is, this is great to kind of be able to see, these critical and high and medium. How are users able to kind of keep up and stay on top of and assess vendor disclosed vulnerabilities?
Sure. So vulnerability management is just a challenge, I would say, in most organizations, right? We all have many different operating systems that we're working with from lots of different vendors, and there's no really streamlined way to go about, getting all of those into a centralized place. So you have tools like, vulnerability scanners like Nessus and Tenable. They're going out there and trying to scan and identify these kind of things. And then you're signing up for all the vendors' email lists so that you get emailed when they're coming out with some of this stuff, or you can go and sign up for some of the CVE NIST alerts. But it's challenging to really have a unified approach to this. So what I think, this offering from Gluware does is really gives network administrators the capability of having a kind of global view of everything that Gluware is managing, and allowing them to prioritize what makes sense and what do we need to go and address. I think one of the potential additional items we might want to look at in the future with Gluware is adding some additional logic around that to help identify both, not just are you vulnerable, but are you also vulnerable from a configuration standpoint to that specific vulnerability has been identified. But yeah, I think this tool definitely gives network administrators an additional tool inside of their belt to go and manage vulnerabilities at the enterprise level.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it is a challenge, but what Gluware is offering with the NIST integration is that consolidation. You kind of have if you have your pane view or the view of the network and the network devices through Gluware, now you have integration to see all the NIST vulnerabilities and Cisco vulnerabilities in one place. You're doing less of that searching around to consolidate the information, and then you can begin to assess and then take action. And what our users are doing, and what was Tim was talking about, is like the next steps you take is you may want to then search your network configs, or you may want to run an audit to see if you have the condition that vulnerability is describing. So today in Gluware, that's what you do. You would read the vulnerability, and then you would move on into a search or an audit to try to determine the exposure. And likely you want to have an incrementing library to continue running those types of searches and or audits to figure out if that situation pops up. The other piece of it is you may go, oh, I am exposed, I need to plan an operating system upgrade, and then you can move on to Gluware OS Manager and do an upgrade. Another path may be, oh, well, the vulnerability has a workaround, a config workaround. And so you could plan and implement that with config modeling and implement your config workaround. So I think, just the understanding or the ability to view the vulnerabilities is really just step one, right? Is the identify phase and understand, and then you have to assess it. And again, search and audit, and then you take an action. Maybe it's an OS upgrade or a config workaround type of thing. But where Gluware supports those capabilities, we are looking at more integrated ways to kind of guide the user to make this even more automated. Other important note on this is that right out of the box, this new integration will work once you turn on the API integration. But if you go to the NVD, the NIST website, you can request an API key. If you put that API key in, you're going to significantly improve the rate limiting that they impose on the API. So you go from, I think it's 10 per minute to 100 per minute. So you can, if you have a bigger inventory and you want that API interaction to happen faster, you want to do that. The last big rock of this release is around Syslog and the ability to do Syslog messaging. And I already talked about this a little bit in the intro, but that Gluware had already onboarded a Syslog capability. We run Syslog NG, and when you enable Syslog in the system, we're spinning up a containerized version of Syslog NG, which then is ultimately providing our Syslog services. And we have the ability first to capture Syslog messages as a Syslog listener to correlate it with config changes. So you'd have that visibility in things like drift and audit, and you could trigger things like drift and audit. This new capability in Gluware 4.2 is around sending Syslog messages. So when you're running a logging server and you're correlating events and messages, you now have the ability to go into Gluware, a new configuration setting called logging. If you can see the screenshot here, then you enable Syslog and you have to put in the IP address of the host. And then you turn on all of the different Syslog messages or events that you want to enable Gluware to send to your logging server around user activity, device activity, and system activity. You probably want to be a little bit conscious or careful on this in that, these could be a lot of messages. So, you got to think about what you want to turn on here. But Tim, from a security perspective, what are people using Syslog for to help improve the security posture?
Yeah, so the general idea is to centralize all of your logging information into one place, and this gives you a few different benefits, right? So from a forensic standpoint, if there's an incident that happens on the network, either something breaks or there's potentially a security incident, you really want to have one place for your incident response investigators to go to analyze and see what happened, so they don't have to reach out to all sorts of different devices, and it extends the time that takes them to figure out what might have happened. And then the second capability is really on a more of a proactive threat approach, right? So once you've centralized all of the logs and you can start to model your user behavior, you can start to identify deviations in that behavior. And so often when you start to see deviations, it could be indicative of something like a compromised account or potentially an insider threat, somebody that's trying to do something before they leave the company or trying to exfiltrate data, whatnot. But really getting all of that data centralized into one place so that you can start to perform that analytics is the first step in that process.
And that's great insight, Tim. As I'm looking through this list, one of the things you turn on is user sign-in failure, right? You should be kind of tracking how many times people are signing in. And if you get a bunch of failures, maybe they're trying to hack into the system or gain access with and just guessing credentials. And so, again, this is more of an outbound threat, but if you have someone if you see an unusual activity around someone making changes to the network or a user ID that someone has oversight of this, those key oversight and actions and understanding it from what's kind of typical and standard and baseline. And when you see these unusual spikes, is to get ahead of it and proactively look into it. And it kind of gives you that instrumentation and visibility. So this is something customers have asked for and is an important capability to have in terms of enabling for overall view and visibility of the network. So excited to make this available for customers. Just a quick thing too is I encourage you to read the release notes. We'll also have a blog coming up about the release that goes into some more depth because there's always more minor features and things. But what you're going to see across just a few additional features is in Device Manager, you have an audit summary view. So you get on a per device view, you can see a summary of all the audits that were run on it. When you run ad hoc query, the behavior has changed a little bit to enable the selection of last run. A previous release, we added the ability where when you run a query, and again, a query, you're either executing a search or you're executing the engine that's going to go out and run show commands on devices and pull that information. And that you want to always be able to browse back to the last run results. And so now there's a new dropdown. Instead of just showing you the last run, you can navigate away from it and then navigate back to it with the last run option. In Config Drift, the email notification has improved, which now has the attachment of the drift message, what the drift was as an attachment. And then the last on this list is around scheduler. When you schedule events, you're defining a set of targets. And now you have the ability to convert from a static list of targets to a dynamic list of targets. And by dynamic, you can include like wildcards or filters to say, any Cisco iOS or you could even, select a subset where you're essentially defining a dynamic list. And then if your inventory is ever changing, when you're executing that scheduled event, like most importantly around a drift or an audit, anything new will be picked up because the dynamic list, it will match the criteria and run it. So that's nice to go back and edit certain events you have running to take them from static to a dynamic list. So with that, two quick slides in summary. We want to kind of paint the vision of what it's like to work with Gluware and the intelligent network automation. And I kind of like to describe it in, 30, 60, 90 is in that first, few weeks of running Gluware, you're executing device manager, you're getting a very detailed inventory, you're doing network discovery. Now you know exactly what devices are in your network, what operating systems. You are integrating the NIST vulnerability and Cisco PCerts, so you're understanding, what vulnerabilities may be there. You have the ability to search configs. You have the ability to execute ad hoc queries, so you're troubleshooting and becoming much more intelligent about what you have running in the network. In the next phase of it, you're executing config, drift, and audit. Drift enables you to monitor configs for change. Again, hooked in with Syslog, in real time what happened, who changed it, and what did they change. We've talked about audit quite a bit and the importance of it, auditing for security standards, auditing for your own company specifications and rules. Then you can begin to move on to OS Manager, where if you had sites and devices that are running old operating systems and you're exposed to vulnerabilities, to execute and get a plan in place to execute operating system upgrades. In the next phase of it, and this one kind of goes all along the way, but it's about layering in the intelligence, the insight, and the data-driven insight to then, move on to the final phase. But dashboards give you that visual indication of what's happening in the underlying system. This can be management level and layer. This can be operational layer, where I'm really tightly operating config changes and audits and drifts and operating system upgrades. And Data Explorer gives you the ability to generate reports out that are, inventory reports or audit reports, operating system version reports, and whatever reporting systems and integrations you need and ongoing monitoring. This is where you're really deriving all that data. And now with that visibility and with that data, you move into really kind of the final phase of working with Gluware, which is around implementing config changes, rolling out and standardize individual features, as well as more, I'd say, difficult challenges like automating EVP and VXLAN in your data center. It can be quite a challenge, and Gluware can take on that challenge. It does take time because you likely will be implementing custom data models. And then to begin with our workflow application and process automation. So once you have those things in place, Gluware enables the moving on to the next layer. And this layer is really more for the sophisticated user. This is using Gluware Lab, which is a low-code environment using JSON-based data modeling, JavaScript-based business logic. You can customize network features, you can extend capabilities, you can integrate APIs, and you can really make it your own. And a lot of our savvy users are really enjoying this level of customization because you don't have to wait for Gluware when you want something new. You can literally extend the platform and make it your own. The next set or capability, Gluware is very excited for this, and this is kind of where the excitement and new announcement comes in, is that we've begun to work with customers on our new Network RPA. Network RPA is really our next generation of process automation. It's around taking all the things we do in the underlying platform and giving the users the ability to, in a no-code manner, describe and execute end-to-end processes. So you can tie any, and the benefit here is you have the full underlying stack or integrated stack of Gluware around your device management and discovery and drift and audit, operating system upgrades and config modeling. You have all that deep capability available to you, along with what's going to be a growing library of third-party integrations. So we're very excited that RPA is now in beta, and we're working with key customers on this. And I will just say, stay tuned, because we have some very exciting announcements and demonstrations coming up where you're going to see RPA in action. And we're targeting getting it to general availability within about 2 to 3 months. So we're looking at end of Q1, beginning of Q2 to really get this out there in customers' hands and enable intelligent process automation. With that, the vision of Gluware is that to keep driving forward and to get into the next phase of tying in and building on all the data that we have and layering in AI and ML driven autonomous automation. Hopefully you saw our press release last week. We brought in Ernest Leffner, our new Chief Product Officer. We brought in Tim Silverline to lead our security automation efforts. And we brought in Stanislav, who is going to lead our AI efforts. So really exciting future for here at Gluware around integrating these features. So with that, a little maybe a little long-winded on the slides in the intro, but let's wrap it up with this final slide around when you think about what Gluware automates. We automate what's considered the legacy, but it's still what most enterprises have, which is the CLI-driven infrastructure. Again, multi-vendor over 30 operating systems. The API-driven infrastructure from a southbound standpoint. So this is where you usually have controllers in place like Cisco SD-WAN, which is Viptela acquisition, Cisco ACI, Meraki, F5, and others. And then I talked about a little bit in the beginning, the cloud infrastructure. And this is where we're leveraging Terraform as a vendor adapter to automate the public clouds like AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud. And then with Gluware sitting in that O&A layer, it's also about API integrations and integrations with the management plane like ServiceNow, Infoblocks for an IPAM, or GitHub for a source code repository, and more. So this is where we're starting to tie in process automation to integrate with your ticketing systems and IPAMs and others and make it a fully end-to-end automated process and evolve from task automation to process automation. So with that, again, thank you, Tim, for joining me for this portion of the webinar. This concludes the slide intro, and we're going to jump into the live demonstrations. Okay, here in this first demonstration, we're going to demonstrate the GluAPI. So those of you who are using Gluware, you have your system, you're signed into it. When you navigate in, you then have your user profile. You can look at the organizations, and you navigate into applications like Device Manager, and you discover your devices or run network searches, or you navigate into Audit, which we're going to be highlighting in another demonstration, and you're interacting with the product through the user interface. What we're going to introduce in this demonstration is how to use the GluAPI and highlight for you how you can exercise some of the new features and capabilities introduced in Gluware 4.2. So the first step in working with the GluAPI is turning it on. So you go into settings and you go into your organization settings, and under organizations, you have to ensure that the GluAPI is enabled. By clicking this box and then determining your authentication method, in this case, I'm managing my users directly through Gluware and the integrated role-based access control. So that is there. I want to check this, determine how I'm authenticating, and then make sure you click the Save button. By doing that, you're spinning up the capabilities in Gluware on the back end to turn on the API endpoint services. Without that turned on, Gluware is not going to be listening and responding to any API request. So that's part one. Part two is to understand where the Gluware API documentation is located, and it is integrated with your instance. So all you have to do is use your instance IP, and then after your system name or address, you type API-docs, close your parenthesis there, your slash, and it loads the API documentation as you see here. And then if you're just getting used to using APIs, you're basically working with things like gets and posts type commands. A lot of where you're collecting information, you're using commands like gets to get information out of Gluware, and with posts, you're pushing information into your Gluware instance. But you can scroll through the documentation and get an understanding of the API calls and the parameters and example output, and other queries and things you can use. Like this one, if you execute this call on your system, a get, and you're specifying the devices, and you potentially use the query for your particular organization, you will pull those devices in. So with that introduction being said, the way we're going to execute and look at Gluware is using really one main external tool and one additional piece of software that I find very complementary when using or exercising the API. So let me minimize the Gluware UI, and now I'm going to show you this software that I've played with a few of them. This is just a personal preference or recommendation, is something called the ARC client, the Advanced REST client, or ARC for short. It was supported by or provided by MuleSoft, which I believe was acquired by Google. So with a product like this, as a non-programmer, or if you're not a DevOps guy, but you want to understand how the APIs work and test the APIs, and then maybe pass them on to a programming resource that's going to integrate these APIs with your programmatic resource, what they're going to ask you is, well, what calls do you want me to make, and what are the requirements to programmatically integrate this solution? So let's take a look at that. So just a couple example calls to just demonstrate this, and we'll leave you towards learning and continuing on your education about how to use it. But let's take a look at this. One of the first calls you need to do with Gluware is, as you saw in the UI, Gluware is multi-user as well as it's multi-tenant. We call those tenants organizations. So one of the first things you want to execute is you want to use the get to pull the organizations, and we are using basic authentication. So I'm passing the user credentials. These user credentials are passed with each API call. They authenticate the session and then enable you with the same role-based access control as assigned in the system to this user. So let's take this call and send it to the Gluware system, which again, this is my Gluware instance, and I'm leveraging that API endpoint, and I'm going to send it. So with sending that API call, I get the response from my Gluware system in this JSON structure. So there's some important parameters here, and it's showing me I have the Gluware demo org and the parent org, which is the Gluware system org, which is always there by default unless you delete it. So the main organization I'm working with in this demonstration is called the Gluware demo org. And there's a parameter I need for subsequent calls, which is this ID. So if I was working with this programmatically, I would be storing this value. When I'm working it here more ad hoc with understanding how to exercise and demonstrate the API calls, I need to store those variables. So what I will suggest to you as a user of this product, I suggest you also have some sort of notepad. I find Notepad++ very handy because you can tell it the language is JSON, and then it will kind of put the output into much more readable components. But what I do while exercising the GluAPI is I take the output that I'm capturing the orgs, and I create a little note called organizations, and this is the org I'm working with. So in a subsequent call, if I need a variable, I can just come here and grab it on a more easy basis. This is just a personal preference or recommendation for how to work with or exercise the API a little better. So let's move on to the next call and I'll click on, since I have these calls loaded, I don't have to retype them in. It's a little slow to execute here. Let me clear the past output. And the UI here is, let me clear it, see if the UI is a little unresponsive. Let's give it a second to reply. Okay. So I've cleared out the response. Now I'm executing another call. And again, you can refer to the GluAPI documentation where this is actually not the call I wanted. Hold on one second. Let me pull this one up. You kind of want to work logically in order here. You want to get the organizations. Then another one to a good call to understand and get is your device list. So now I'm pulling the Gluware system,
and pulling for the devices, but I'm including a query. Whoops. Let me bring that back. I'm including a query for the devices in the org. I hope I didn't mess up this call. Let's see here. Let me clear the output of this response. I'm querying for the devices that have the org ID equal to this value. So if you remember, I already pulled the org. Here's the ID. It ends in C3F92. I can see C3F92. And so now I'm going to query the Gluware system and pull the devices. So let's send that request, communicating with the Gluware system, again, passing the same credentials. And I can see here I get the JSON structure that returns back all of the devices in the details. So I have that full JSON structure. And again, what I often do is just copy and paste the output into a file that I could refer back to. So if I want to go pull, something related to this very specific 3650 switch, likely I will need its internal Gluware ID. Gluware is storing all this information in the internal databases, and we allocate these IDs to keep track of these JSON data models. So moving on kind of more into the use cases associated with Gluware 4.2. 4.2 is expanding a lot of things you can do with the API around executing audits and policies and things like that. So let's take a look at something more audit related, which is this call is saying, get me the audit policies in the system. And let me go ahead and run that call. And I get my response. And it returns back for me the policies that are available. So if I were to look inside Gluware, which I can navigate and show you, let me do that right now. Let's go back to this instance. And if I navigate into audit, I see all of these policies are available. Well, if I want to run these programmatically, meaning trigger them programmatically or look at results programmatically, I need to know what audit policies are there. So I can see these lists of audit policies. By pulling it through the API call, I can pull in that same information with other metadata, like the created on and created by, the ID, which again is important to run it again. But here you can see the DoD STIG for Cisco, iOS, iOS XE, and you get some various information about that as well. And you can scroll down through this information. So now you have your audits, and again, recommend saving data that you may need out to a Notepad++ or something similar. I can capture this particular audit ID and hit copy, and then let's say I want to see executions, but I want to see executions of a specific audit. So I can and if you're ever, again, not sure about the format of the call, you can navigate back to your Gluware instance and pull up your documentation. And if we look into audits here, and we scroll down here, you have the ability to execute an audit. Here you have the ability to get audits that were executed. So you have the get and audit executions. And then you have the ability to attack on additional parameters, like if you want to retrieve audit execution by an audit ID, you include the ID as part of the call as described here. Okay, so one quick last final demonstration here around, I've pulled the policies that are available. Now I want to pull information about policies that were executed. So what I can do is, let me look at, I'm going to run a command to get the results or pull the executions, and I'm going to include in the query my organizational ID. Again, I'm saying what executions have run specifically in this org, and I can run that query. If I clear the response here, I can rerun this query here. I'll give it a second for it to for the UI to catch up. Let's try that again. Let's clear the response. Okay. Now let's go ahead and send this query for the specific organization. And I got a response okay, and it should update with the data that it's pulled over that API. And here we go. We get the JSON structure back, and I can see that the various audit runs to completion are in here. And if I scroll down, I can see when it was run and the status of each execution, and you get that detail. So don't want to get too deep in this demo, just want to give you an introduction to how you can turn on the Gluware API endpoint, how you can use a product like Arc here to exercise that endpoint, and how recommend that you save out your variables or understand how you're working with it. Because even as a network engineer, as you may be passing this off to an integration or DevOps engineer to integrate it programmatically, they're going to be asking you a lot of information like what API calls do you want me to onboard, what variables do I need to manage, and what data are you looking at getting out of this? Like I talked about use cases before, but if you're synchronizing inventory or in a separate product, if you're triggering drifts or audits or config changes, you're going to want to know and understand how to leverage those API calls. So this concludes the demo on the Gluware API. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at the new features of the next generation config audit as part of the config drift and audit app. So here we are on the dashboard. To get into the config drift and audit app, we use the left pane and you use your choices over here, and you navigate into config drift and audit and navigate into your audit policies. And so from this view, you're not going to see much different, but what I want to do is click into one of the audits here. And let's take a look at some of the differences that 4.2 has introduced. Okay, this audit has been run, so let's go ahead and navigate into the editor. And so what I'd like to do to really show you the differences is show you a side by side comparing it with Gluware in prior to 4.2. So one of the things you'll notice is when you navigate into your audit, and let me navigate into the same audit and navigate right into the editor. In the old version of audit, your rules were displayed in an expanded type of format, and you navigate through like this. And you can see the rules as required or forbidden and some parameters here. So one of the things you're going to notice right away is the next generation audit has carryover, so it's fully backwards compatible with old audits. You have your name, description. One of the new things that's introduced is a permission level that's tied into role-based access control. So you have 3 levels of permission. And then we have a new grid display for your audit rules. So what you're going to see here is if you look at this, one of a new column and new capability is tagging the severity of an audit rule. And we'll dig into that a little bit more. But first of all, this grid format is going to present you with the ability to very quickly and easily look through your rules, severity, name, description, source, OS, concept items, if there's queries tied to them, and so on. What you do have carryover as well is in the old version, you could clone and you could change the order of the rules and you could delete the rules. All those actions are now here. You can edit your rule, you can clone your rule, you can delete them, and you can change the order. But one of the ways you can change the order is this the drag and drop capability. So you can drag a rule around and change the order in your audit. So let's jump into editing one of these rules, and let's look at the difference here. So now as you jump into edit a rule, you get to a little bit more of a comparable view, what you had in prior to 4.2. So you're going to see a couple things where now you have the option of selecting the source. The source being the latest snapshot is when you're executing audits or you're executing config drifts. If you're instructing Gluware to capture the config, we're going out and capturing the latest configuration, and that becomes the latest snapshot. If you have performed a configuration and you flag it as your default snapshot, then it is that parameter. But generally with a drift and audit, what you want to audit and keep looking at is the latest snapshot and continuing on from there. So that is the default. Then you have the operating system that this rule is tied to. Since you're going to be putting in a rule that is CLI based, CLI and regex based, you're going to have to tell it which operating system, and you can choose from any of the supported operating systems. Concept item is for when you're using Gluware and config modeling, we understand particular configured features like AAA or DNS or NTP. And in that case, Gluware is not going to look at, when auditing, it's not going to look at the entire configuration and search through an audit. Gluware is going to execute the show command to look at just the snippet of that piece and just look at that feature. So it's a little bit advanced, out of scope for the demo today. We'll leave it out, but understand that feature is still there. And then you still have the ability to define the scope in regular expression, very useful. But here's where the big difference comes into play. The old rule type was what we now define as a simple audit policy or rule, which it is required or forbidden. So that translates into the new UI as a simple rule. You can then use a drop down to add more layers to the assessment. Must contain, must not contain, with regex, must contain ordered, must contain only. So this is expanded, but it does encompass these flags that you saw in the previous version of saying it must have all these statements, it must be in this order, or the only option. So the only being that you can't have other components around what you're specifying. So you can see some expansion here in the rule set. But the biggest change in this release and the most power comes from the addition of the logical operators. So you can add in the if-then and the if-then-else type of commands, and we're going to get into that. Another really cool and powerful capability is the ability to test the rule. And we're going to look at that next. And essentially, this is where you're defining your rules. So from a comparison view, those are the main things to kind of understand when you're kind of comparing the previous version to the new version. The other thing you will see is in your settings, when you go into your organizational settings and you go into your role-based access controls, roles. Let me move this over a bit. When you go into roles, and you look at, I think I'm a system developer in this case. So if I view my role-based access control, and you scroll down to device, in your role-based access control here, sorry, skipped over it. Config, drift, and audit. You have additional parameters here of exposing more role-based access controls around level 1 and level 2 and level 3 audits. So you're layering in some capabilities and again can tie it to the role-based access control. So with that quick summary, let's go ahead and minimize this guy and maximize this view, and let's get back into drift and audit. And I just want to take this a little bit further to show you an example of audits and how they can go a little bit more in a little bit more depth. So let's go ahead and view this rule I've created. And here's where the power of the new config audit comes into play. And this one comes up all the time. Hey, I want to audit for a parameter, but I want to do a conditional, and I want to say if something, like if my host name contains NA for North America, then my configuration must contain these specific NTP servers as part of the configuration. So this is actually kind of fun when you start to think about how expansive this gets into, but you can look at, if my operating system, or if the IP address, or if the, any of these conditions, if the serial number, if the SKU, if the zone, you have a lot of parameters to dig into, and then you have a lot of other operators like equal or not equal or begins with or contains, and then you can add your parameter and compare. So again, in this use case, I'm saying if the NTP server, if the host name contains NA, which is a flag for North America, it must contain this. So let's jump into the second, kind of say big change here is that you can jump into the test rule parameter. But to do that, I want to do something first. In my lower view here, I'm going to navigate to my device view, and I'm going to click into a one of these devices like that has NA in the name. I'm going to just double click on this device. It opens up my detailed view on the top, and you might be looking at this view. If you navigate over to your config view, this view is going to show you the last configuration. So what I'm going to do is grab this config. I'm just going to copy it out of here. And I'll do a Control C. Now I'm going to go back to my audit. So here I am auditing for NTP, and I want to navigate into test rule. So in test rule, in your test data, this is where you want to put example configuration data. So I'm going to Control V and paste the config in here. So now you can see I have a full-blown Cisco router config sitting in here. Now I'm going to test this rule that's looking for, it happens to be, I can see that what it's looking for right here, the NTP configuration. And if you just make your window long enough here, I can hit test, and I can test the rule. So here I see the outcome where it has given me the output and saying, based on what you just built, this is going to pass. So you have a good and pass condition here. So once you've tested it, you cancel out of the test view. If you close this, you're going to close your whole tab. So don't close. You can reopen it. It's not a problem. But what you want to do is just cancel out of the test view, and you're back here. So now you've tested and validated your rule. So let me go ahead and hit back. Let's take this one step further, and I'll edit this next rule, which expands the logic you can build. And I'm hoping network engineers seeing this are going to appreciate that this no-code approach, you don't have to know any underlying code or semantic, just a little bit of regex is helpful, and obviously knowing the CLI you want to audit for. We're going to expand this by doing an if-then-else operator. So if the host name contains NA for North America, it must, if then it must contain these servers. And then I have an else condition that I still want to validate NTP is configured, but let's just say that outside North America, I'm using a lot of different NTP IPs or whatever may be the case. So I just have a regex wildcard here, and I want to validate that all my other devices at least have NTP configured. They don't necessarily have to have the IPs for North America. And again, I can test the rule, and I see the config is still here, and here's the then, so I can test it. Obviously, we've already tested this one. Now I can continue to test the else. And so we can say, will this config, if it doesn't have NA in the name, will it actually pass the else parameter? I can hit test, and it passes the else parameter too. So you can have some fun with this. These are no-code ways to build audits, and I'll go ahead and cancel out of here. But hopefully you can see here the power of this next generation of audit gives you the ability to define the severity of the rule and define much more complicated rules to edit and assess your install base. So the last thing to mention here is that while we are pretty significantly edited and enhanced the ability for more complex rules, I do want to highlight that, and let me jump back out to the summary here. Any of your existing audit policies will be converted into this format, and you don't lose anything. So really backwards compatibility from a running standpoint. But when you do execute and kind of go into your rules, and let me just navigate back into like this Cisco CIS example. As you navigate into the rules, and that's the result view. Let me go back into editing of the. The old rules will be imported in as simple rules. So that's just something to be aware of. but you obviously still have the ability to import and export your audit policies like you have in the past. So if once you're done editing and you're happy with this, you can download it out and save it out in JSON format and share it with your peers. And also just a reminder that you can go to the Gluware customer portal, and we have quite a few example audits, including Cisco iOS audits and Junos audits as well for some of the security specifications out there. So this concludes the demonstration on the new and enhanced Config Audit. In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at the NIST integration added to pull multi-vendor vulnerabilities from the NIST database. The first step in terms of integrating with NIST is to go into your settings of your organization. In your org, you're going to go into the Integrations tab. This is where you may be familiar with already having the Cisco API integration set up and configured. This one is not. So you can pull Cisco end-of-life, end-of-sale, and things like pcerts for Cisco vulnerabilities. The new feature here in Gluware 4.2 is enabling the NIST NVD API. So you tick this box to enable it. We warn you that we are pulling information from a third party into the application. You can optionally put in an API key. We do recommend this step, that you go to the NIST.org website, you request an API key. This will dramatically improve your performance. You'll go from 10 requests per minute to 100. So if you have a larger network inventory and you want to process these, you're going to want to request and insert that key. With or without the key, you can test your connectivity with the test button. Highly suggest you do that. Just click test, and you're going to wait a few minutes or however long it takes, a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on if you have a large a base that's passing test data. And it's going to give you a message. You should receive this. If you don't receive this, you're probably going to want to talk to your IT team about your Gluware's installed instance and its ability to make outbound API calls. Now, with that being enabled, we're pretty much ready to go. Two other quick things. One is I do recommend you turning on this as a scheduled activity where it can pull this API information daily. That way you don't have to kind of remember to go and trigger it and look at stale data. So I do recommend you tick this box and turn it on. Another very important step in this screen is to click the save button. If you don't click that save button, it's not going to save. So with those things set up, I'm going to navigate into another org which has a lot of devices and more devices for me to kind of play around with from an integration standpoint. And let me navigate into Device Manager. So in Device Manager is where the main integration you're going to see with NIST and the ability to dive into some of the details. But because the data is exposed in the Device Explorer, this grid, Device Explorer is common to most our applications like Drift and Audit and OS Manager, so you can see that data there as well. So with your devices here, you have two ways to actually trigger that API call. One is, as I mentioned, you should have it scheduled where it's going automatically. The second is you can select a group of devices, like I can shift and select or click on select or control A and select all, and I can click on the update support data, and so it's going to say for these devices I'm going to take these devices, create the format required, and then pass it off to Cisco and or NIST to pull the required data. I hit confirm, and it's executing that collection leveraging the third-party API. And so one thing to say about that is if you do have devices of if you have like a bunch of the same devices, Gluware is not going to execute individual requests for the devices of the same type. Gluware has a post process that's going to consolidate that list to minimize the API calls required or the data set required to make that call. So once you've had that integration and you've made that API call, the data is now available. As I scroll over to the right, these columns were already available from our integration with Cisco, where you're going to see critical, high, and mediums, right? There should be lows as well. You can turn that on. And in fact, the way, if you don't see that data in your grid, you go into the cog here and scroll down and you will see critical, high, and mediums. I don't believe there are lows. Critical, high, and medium, you want to make sure those are turned on so you see them in your view. Now let's take a look at some examples of this NIST data. So let me, again, probably a little helpful to see the columns that are here. So let me navigate into this device here. So this is an Arista device that I'm seeing some counts. And so when you have non-zero numbers, like if you have 0 advisories, you're not going to see this view. If you have non-zeros, you're going to see this new view show up called Advisory Summary. You click on that view, and then you're going to see the data pulled in from NIST around your critical, high, and medium vulnerabilities. And then you can either use this float over and navigate the view in that respect, or you can double click in, same way if you've used our Cisco PCERT integration, you double click in, you see the advisory information and any details about it. So back to just the point of this is that, Gluware now supporting over 30 operating systems and multi-vendor, in addition to having Cisco PCERTs, you have vendor vulnerability for vendors such as Aruba and Fortinet and Juniper and Arista and Palo Alto and others. So let's just go down the list here. Let's take a look at this Aruba device. Again, the Aruba device has vulnerabilities as well. I click in and I see these vulnerabilities across critical, high, and medium. So when you're working with Gluware and you do find that these are disclosed, then you want to perform your assessment. You want to look at the data. Hopefully there's enough data that's visible here. You can always click into this and navigate directly to NIST. But you could understand if, the way you're using this device in your network is exposed to this vulnerability or not. So there's a bit of an assessment that happens. Then you may want to search your configurations or audit your configurations to see if you're exposed. And then if you are exposed and there needs to be a workaround or some implementation, you may move on to use our app to automate the operating system upgrade, or move on to config modeling, where you are automating and pushing a config change as a workaround. So I can close these views out, but again, continuing this kind of multi-vendor assessment as I scroll down here. Let's take a look at, here's Cisco, which we've seen in the past. Let's just take a look down in terms of, okay, so here's Juniper. So I can click into the Juniper, just showing that we're pulling in this multi-vendor data now that you can assess the vulnerabilities disclosed through NIST. And as again, NIST calls these CVEs, and then you have the CVE data that you can cross-reference with the NIST site or refer to for your internal tracking or purposes. And I just want to highlight that this is available to you now. And the same integration is available to you as you navigate into Dashboard or you navigate into Data Explorer. This data is available to you to visualize and also generate reports. So this concludes a quick demonstration of the new NIST integration for multi-vendor vulnerability tracking. This last demonstration will be very short. It's around the new Syslog sending capabilities. So to turn on Syslog Sender, you navigate into your settings for your org. Then there's a new option for logging. And this is where you're going to turn on your Syslog sending capability. You're going to put in the IP address of the host or host you're going to be sending to. Then you're going to turn on the type of Syslog messages that you want to send. So event information, this is probably most critical around security. That's going to track user sign in, sign out, and maybe most importantly, the sign in failure. If you're getting a bunch of sign in failures, chances are someone might be trying to maliciously access your system. Next is you can see activities around device activity and device manager and the various things you're doing. You maybe something, if a user has access to do it, but they're maybe abusing it, is they have the ability to reboot or reset devices within Gluware. This is another one that could, if you have an outage or you're trying to correlate why a device went down and came back up, and you can correlate a syslog to someone use Gluware to reboot a device when maybe they shouldn't have, even though they had permission or a role-based access control to do that. and so on and so forth. You can see a lot of the data here. You can turn on all of these things. I will warn you or caution you that if you are using Gluware very actively, or you have a lot of users and you're doing a lot of activities around drifts and audits and device managers and discoveries and changes, and you're turning on all of these notifications, you want to just make sure your system is available and capable of handling all this. It really just depends on the sizing and parameters of your Syslog server, but just note that you may want to start small and kind of turn on certain messages and then increment. And you certainly probably want to exercise or test this, as you're a part of your network operations teams and the administrators of your Syslog server that are going to be catching these new messages. You certainly don't want to just turn this on and not give them full notice that you're turning on additional messaging. Configuration has a little more detail here where you can come in and edit the default port. It's going to default to the UDP port 514 for sending these messages, and you have control of that as well. So again, very short here, but essentially we're just turning on the ability to send Syslog messages, and we already have had the capability in the product to catch Syslog related to users logging in and out of devices to correlate events to trigger things like drift and audit. So with that, this concludes the final demonstration here of the Syslog send feature. So with that brings us to the end of this webinar. We really appreciate your interest in Gluware, and hopefully you found a lot useful in the 4.2 release and see a lot of compelling reasons to either upgrade your existing environment or bring Gluware in for an evaluation. There are 3 kind of key ways you can get started with Gluware. One is you can get Gluware free, gluware.com/free. Check it out. You can, run an instance from AWS, install Gluware Secure Gateway, and you're kind of going to be off and running to run Gluware in your own environment. More than likely, that will be in a test lab or some way you have to kick the tires with some devices, but we want you to be able to get your hands on it. Another very useful way and a pretty fun way is to take the test drive, gluware.com/test-drive, request it. Within 24 hours or so or under, we spin you up your own instance, and we point you to over 5 hours of video material to follow along, tutorials to understand how the product works across Device Manager and Drift and Audit and config modeling and OS Manager and more. The third option is if you just want to engage with our team, request a demo, talk about your requirements, and make sure Gluware could be a good fit for your team to evaluate and bring in for automation orchestration, gluware.com/demo, and just request a demo, and we'll be in touch with you very quickly. You can also email sales@gluware.com for any other ways you'd like to engage. So again, we appreciate your time and interest in Gluware and look forward to speaking with you soon. Thanks very much.